For a conversation about saving the oceans, please welcome Janis Searles Jones, the CEO of the Ocean Conservancy, here with Atlantic Deputy Editor Ross Anderson.
Janis, thank you for being here with us today. I suspect, like most people in this room, I woke up this morning sort of looking at a push notification about a new report from the IPCC about climate change in the ocean. And these reports and even these push notifications have become sort of a normal part of global life, I'm afraid, such that it can be hard to distinguish them, even when it's your job, one after another. There's kind of this consistent parade of horrors. And so I wondered if you could tell us what's new about this one.
Happy to. So this was the third special report that the IPCC did, and it's called STrack for short. It is the special report on the ocean and cryosphere in our changing climate. And just for folks who don't know, the cryosphere is basically frozen water. So it's glaciers, it's ice caps, it's snow, and it's frozen ground. And this is a really important, it's sort of the capstone report that the IPCC put out. And what it does is look at what is happening with the ocean and frozen water in light of climate change. And the reason why it feels repetitive in some ways is because the news is not very good. We saw this in the first IPCC report on the difference between 1.5 degree and a 2 degree future. We saw this in the report on land, and now we are seeing it in the report on the ocean. So it is a very important report because it's really the first time that scientists across the globe looked at over 7,000 studies. There were more than 31,000 comments, over 100 authors, and it is very, very clear that the ocean and climate are inextricably linked and that the ocean is failing in light of climate change. It has done so much to absorb heat. Over 90% of the heat that we have created through carbon dioxide emissions has been absorbed by the ocean. It's absorbed 30% of carbon dioxide emissions, which creates more acidity in the ocean. And so we have warmer waters, more acidic waters. And one of the things that the SROC report really highlighted is the rate of sea level rise that was predicted is increasing dramatically. And so this is a very real clarion call for policymakers to reduce emissions right away, because it paints a very stark picture of what's going to happen with our low-lying communities, with our food supply, with increased frequency and intensity of storms. It's a very clear signal that we actually need to act on emissions very quickly.
Can I ask you to do a little media criticism for me? As someone who thinks about the oceans all the time, how do you feel that are we doing a good job of reporting the effects of climate change on the oceans relative to the effects on land?
No. To state it simply, we actually did a media audit because we were interested in this question. As an ocean conservation organization, we are all ocean all the time. And I would say that the media has done a much better job in the past few years reporting on climate. So you have climate stories every day. But ocean figures in those climate stories only once about every 5 to 10 days. And ocean solutions show up in those stories very rarely. But the one thing about the SROC report that I will say is I think that that's going to change as of today. It's become increasingly clear that you can't report on climate without also reporting on the ocean. So we're very hopeful that media will always fold ocean into climate stories, because it really needs to do that to fully resolve the climate crisis and the ocean crisis that we're facing.
Are there, now, just to get into the science a little bit, one thing that I hear from the uninitiated in ocean sciences is, well, okay, so some of the waters are warm. Certainly these marine animals, or even the microscopic, the microbes some of them can live in these warmer waters. Are warmer waters bad for all ecologies in the ocean, or will some animals thrive?
So the answer is yes, in the long run. When you think about the ocean, 71% of the planet is covered by ocean. Everything that is there is evolved as part of a system. And so as we are seeing warmer temperatures, we're seeing species move, for example. So fish stocks are moving rapidly. So it may be in the short term that some fish stocks that like warmer waters will do a little bit better. But in the long term, because you have these ecosystems where you have predator-prey dynamics and where you have very intense coupling of what marine fish eat, for example. At the same time that we're warming our waters, we're also increasing ocean acidification, which makes it very difficult for shell-forming animals to form their shells. And a lot of those animals are at the base of the food chain. So it implicates the entire food chain as we're moving things around. So there may be short-term winners and losers, but in the long run, what the science is telling us is that if we don't actually get off the trajectory that we're on, global marine fish catches are likely to decrease by about 25%. So when you look across everything, the picture is one where we need to make rapid change and not focus on sort of a short-term, oh, we have more fish in this one particular region, because we're going to see those long-term changes, and they're really, really dramatic and very important for food security, I should say. About a huge number of people rely on marine protein as their primary source of protein, and so when you're looking at the impact of a warming ocean, an acidifying ocean on human populations, it brings food security really to the fore when we think about how people are going to feed themselves.
Let's talk about coral reefs, one of the really devastating stories. And I know that you said you want us to start talking about solutions, so I want to ask a solution-based question, but start it with like another horrible thing. As I understand it, and you should correct me if I'm wrong, if the oceans were to warm 2 degrees C, we're looking at losing something like 90% of coral reefs on planet Earth. And
99%.
99% of coral reefs on planet Earth, which is an unimaginable tragedy along a lot of cultural and natural dimensions. The thing I wonder is there anything that we can do? You know, it looks like we're going to go blow right by 2C, actually, and maybe even within a few decades. So what is being done on behalf of reefs?
Yeah, so I'll answer with 3 things, one of which I'll make up by the time I get to the third. First of all, have to reduce emissions. So even while we're thinking about solutions and what we can do in the long term, if we don't reduce emissions, you are right that we will blow past that number. Coral reefs are incredibly important for a variety of reasons. One is that they're really biodiverse. So they're only about 2% of the ocean habitats, but they support about 1/4 of all marine species. So in terms of an important habitat type, they're critically important. And they're also incredibly important for human communities, too. They reduce storm surge, their livelihoods, tourism, food, even medicines. So when you look at heat and when you look at acid, it's a huge problem for coral reefs. And so scientists are doing a lot of really interesting things right now to try to create some buffer while we're bringing down those emissions. And some of that is looking for heat-tolerant corals. I mean, there are some corals that do okay in warmer pools, so looking at what it is about those corals that actually allow them to tolerate that heat a little bit better, and then think about whether or not we could do assisted migration, which is to sort of transplant those corals so we can kind of hang on to that genetic stock and help them proliferate in other places. There's also genetics work being done to actually figure out if we can help hybridize some corals and find different ways to create the corals that are actually hardier in the face of both warmth and acidification. So there is a lot of great corals work going on right now, in part out of recognition of how important those coral species are. And I have to, my third point, which I just came up with, it's a really important distinction between a 1.5 degree world and a 2 degree world. The prospects for coral in a 1.5 degree world, we can maybe save 10 to 30% of coral, which would be much better than the 2 degree world, which is about saving 1% of coral. So that added urgency to needing to reduce emissions at the same time as science really dedicating itself to figure out different ways to provide some hope for that coral habitat.
What about ocean currents? This is one of the, along with ocean acidification, I think one of the things that hasn't really trickled out into the public consciousness is how warming will affect ocean currents and then the knock-on effects on ocean ecologies from those changes. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So one of the things that I think people don't truly appreciate about the ocean is it really is the world's conveyor belt when it comes to circulation of temperature. And as I said before, the ocean has absorbed about 90% of the heat. If the ocean hadn't absorbed that heat, surface temperatures on land would be much, much higher. So the ocean is what makes our planet habitable right now. But as we warm up that ocean, we create stratification, which means that the surface layer of the ocean is a lot warmer than it used to be, and there used to be a lot of mixing of the ocean. Warmer waters would sink, you would have cooler waters, more nutrient-rich waters come up, and then you also see that across the poles. So the ocean's what moves cooler water to the tropics, warmer water up to the poles. And as we're changing the temperature of the oceans, we are affecting those currents, and certain currents are starting to slow down. We're seeing water become more stratified, which means there's less oxygen available in that upper layer, which is where the majority of marine life is. And that has huge implications for weather, for fish stocks, for all of the things that we actually need from the ocean, and for the amount of oxygen in the ocean. That is one of the other things that is happening as we're warming the ocean, making it more we're acidifying the ocean. It's capable of holding less oxygen as it gets warmer, and that has huge implications for marine life as well.
Here in DC, it's now illegal to have plastic straws at your restaurant, and I find myself not wanting to break the law, so I just use paper straws like everyone else, but I sort of resent it a little bit because I can't stand paper straws. They kind of wilt by the time you're done with your drink. I'm a slow drinker. And I was wondering if maybe, I feel like I'm teetering on the edge of an epiphany where I won't feel as resentful, and maybe you could make like a strenuous case to get me over.
I will give you one number first, right, which is 3.7. And that number, every year the Ocean Conservancy orchestrates the international coastal cleanup. And you have 1 million volunteers worldwide in over 100 countries, and they go out and clean their local waterways and their beaches. And last year, and we collect all the data. Last year, people collected 3.7 million straws. And so it's not just you and your drink, it is 3.7 straws. And I think straws have really become iconic as a symbol of single-use disposable plastics because of the sea turtle. I mean, how many people saw the video of the sea turtle with a straw up her nose? I mean, those are incredibly powerful images, and it's very clear plastic does not belong in the natural environment. Straws are just sort of the tip of the iceberg, if you will. There are a lot of other single-use plastics. The entire top 10 list of what we collect every year globally are single-use disposable plastics. And so there are lots of alternatives if you don't like paper. There are metal straws, there are straws made out of seaweed, there are a lot of different things, and you could also maybe not use a straw. There are some people who definitely need a straw. You don't strike me as one of those people, so maybe just pass on the straw.
All right, I'm convinced. No more straws. I'll give you a number now.
Right.
It's a number from your own organization, and it's that there's 150 million metric tons of plastic in the ocean today, and 8 million metric tons being added every year. And let's suppose that all the me's out there stop using plastic straws and other single-use plastics. Is there ever any hope within like the next 100 generations of humans of cleaning that plastic up?
There is definitely hope there, but it is going to take, much like climate change, a real concerted effort to think about systems. When you think about how plastic ends up in the ocean, it is as simple as a plastic bag that's sort of tucked into a waste receptacle that catches a gust of wind, ends up in a gutter, heavy rainfall, ends up flowing into the ocean. The ocean really is the end of the pipe for a lot of plastic that's sort of out there in the world. And so there are a lot of things that we can do right now to reduce that flow of plastic. I mean, 8 million metric tons in the ocean is an extraordinary figure. And if we stay on that trajectory, we'll have as much plastic as fish in the ocean by 2050. And nobody wants that. And so there's a lot of science out there that indicates that there are some real hot spots, places where the pace of economic development and population increase has exceeded infrastructure investment. So there are a lot of things that we can do to actually better collect and manage the waste that we're actually generating. But the other thing we really need to think carefully about, if you look at the trajectory for plastics production, it has increased dramatically over the past 20 years. It is slated to increase even more in coming years, and there is no way we're actually going to stop that 8 million metric tons flowing into the ocean every year without actually reducing the amount of single-use plastics in particular that we're using. So there are a lot of things you can do by investing in waste management, by closing the loop, getting to a truly circular economy, but also by reducing the amount of those single-use plastics like that straw. It just doesn't make sense to use a durable material for a one-time use.
Yeah. We've been talking a lot about sea life and non-human ecologies, but I want to talk about human communities a little bit. Could you tell me a little bit about, in terms of the human communities that are being affected by climate change and specific climate changes in the ocean, how are those effects being distributed along socioeconomic lines?
So one of the outcomes of the STrack report is that it made very clear that sea level rise is again happening much faster than we anticipated. And a lot of the frontline communities are small island nations, communities of color, indigenous peoples that are on the front line. They are really our frontline communities when it comes to ocean climate change. And one of the things I will observe, I was in New York earlier this week at New York Climate Week. We did a panel specifically on ocean climate action. And one of the representatives there from the Maldives was talking about what the STrack report and what climate change means for his community, his culture, their home. And the reality is if we don't do something as a planet to aggressively reduce emissions, the Maldives will be underwater and an entire culture that has grown up on an atoll will be gone. So it's a really important reflection of how we need to think about equity, how we need to think about planned retreat and managed retreat for some of these frontline communities and make sure that we're really folding that reality into our climate change work when it comes to adaptation. The impacts are already here. People are feeling the impacts. They are going to get more and more. And so we need to be really creative when we're thinking about adaptation strategies to make sure we're working with frontline communities and giving them a lifeline so that they can continue their cultures and ways of life.
Janis, thanks for being with us today.
It's my pleasure.